Hello, this is Marcus Patchett, the Nocturnal Herbalist, and before I go any further in this video, I just want to say it's a baking hot day in August, so I am sweating buckets, so apologies in advance if I get increasingly shiny as this video goes on. But anyway, this is the first in a series of 6 videos about social isolation, and in this series I'm going to be covering what it is, what physical and mental health effects can arise from it, how that plays into current social distancing policies, what ramifications might there be from that, and then the mechanisms of any physical or mental health problems that might arise from social isolation. How does that happen? And then lastly, I'll be talking about remedies and strategies to prevent health problems, both mental and physical, that arise from social isolation. So that's the whole video series. In this video, I just want to talk specifically about social isolation and loneliness, just to define those terms and distinguish between the two, and then talk a little bit about health risks arising from them. So social isolation, this was defined in a paper by Cacioppo, Capitano and Cole from 2015 as having no spouse, less than monthly contact with family and friends, and no participation in clubs or groups. As compared or contrasted to loneliness, defined in a paper by Shi and Lee in 2018, and by the way, all of these papers will be linked in the description box on YouTube below the video. Loneliness was defined in their paper as being more related to relationship quality than quantity. They also defined it as a felt lack of relationships that provide mutual value and trust and promote communication and collaboration towards common goals. Loneliness can be experienced within a marriage, family, or larger social group. In contrast, one can feel socially connected while being alone. So, in other words, social isolation is objective. It's a factual, real-world lack of actual social contacts with other people. And loneliness is subjective. One can be very well socially connected, so not socially isolated, and still lonely. You know, well-known fact, people can be lonely in relationships, people can be lonely living with people, etc. So it's the difference between the two is subjective, objective. So in terms of health outcomes, both social isolation and loneliness worsen mental and physical health outcomes, at least according to current research. So here are some stats from that second paper by Shi and Lee. They found that loneliness generally increased risk of death from all causes put together by 26%. Social isolation increased risk of death from all causes put together by 29%, and living alone, and this one worries me because I've lived alone since my early 20s, by 32%. And the effects of living alone in terms of increasing risk of death were greater the younger you were. However, I suspect that this might be a little bit of a nested thing where in terms of social isolation and living alone, a large measure of that could be down to loneliness, because presumably living alone and social isolation increase the risk of loneliness. Although I don't know that, that's just me speculating. And perhaps some of the increased risk of death above and beyond the emotional state of feeling lonely associated with social isolation and living alone, perhaps that increased risk is down to practical factors like not having somebody to nag you to go and see the doctor if you're feeling sick, or not having somebody to notice when you've hurt yourself, that kind of thing. Maybe, just a thought. Anyway, some other stats associated with this. There are specific pathologies, illnesses associated with social isolation. So social isolation specifically increases the risk of death by stroke by 32%, and the risk of death by heart disease, coronary heart disease, by 29%. And this is really striking. In terms of those stroke heart disease factors, this is from a paper by Bzdok and Dunbar, a 2020 paper, very recent. They found that the biggest risk factors for heart disease overall were, number one, frequency of social contacts. The fewer social contacts people had, the more their heart disease risk increased. Number two, how well integrated into their social network they were, how close to those people in their social network they felt. And number three, way down at number three, smoking. This should be compared and contrasted to the actual survival benefits of having strong social connections. These same researchers found that people who felt they had a really high level of social support, had a really good friendship circle and were well connected to their family and all the rest, that increased their chance of survival by 50%. Now obviously that's not an absolute figure, again it is a relative figure, meaning it doesn't mean they lived 50% as long as everyone else, it just means that their relative risk of dying in a given time period was reduced by half, which is pretty amazing, right? It's correlations of loneliness particularly, that's the subjective state. More men than women, according to research, feel lonely. Illness and poor health, chronic work and social stress, smaller social networks, and lack of a spousal confidant. All of these are factors which are associated with loneliness in the research. Some of the other physical health risks associated with social isolation, and this is from the Cacioppo and colleagues paper in 2015. This was research done in monkeys. They found that monkeys with unstable social conditions had an increased risk of death from viral infections. So that's interesting given what's going on in the world currently. There was also an increased incidence of neoplastic illnesses or cancer associated with social isolation. And from the Bujdock and Dunbar paper in 2020, they found that persistent loneliness in humans was associated with an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. They define this as loneliness or brittle social conditions, such as having poor family relations, led to a lower volume of regions of the brain associated with reward and emotional processing. And if we're going to get specific, those were the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala and the limbic system. What that means is that the parts of the brain that literally help people feel pleasure shrank in people deprived of positive social contacts. And then the last thing, and this ties in with the increased risk of heart disease and stroke, they found an increased presence of atherosclerosis in people who define themselves as being lonely. And what that means is the narrowing of the diameter of the blood vessels. So an increased presence of inflammation in the linings of blood vessels and increased evidence of repair, which thickens the walls and makes them less elastic and predisposes to heart disease and stroke. So all of that is interesting and a bit worrying. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about the psychosocial effects of social isolation and loneliness, according to current research. So I hope you found this interesting. If you did, please like the video, please subscribe to the channel, please share the video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.